In your house, who is the boss? You or your wife?
I'll be very happy to answer that question. In my household, I am the boss of the household. I think that any man that is afraid of his wife is not a man. And I can't stress this point too strongly, that a husband is the boss.
Yes?
Now, don't quote me because my wife reads at you too.
Well, Martin, you just proved to me something that I've suspected about you for a long time.
Well, you're afraid of Trixie.
Oh, wait a minute. You're no position to talk to me like that.
No. You're not inferring. All I know, pal, is that if he had asked me that question, I would have said without hesitation that I am the boss of my household. I'm the one that gives the orders. I'm the one that makes all the decisions. On the day we were married, I said two things. One, I do. Two, I'm the boss.
Finally, sir, what is your name?
Ralph Brandon.
Mr. Crandon. Mr. Crandon, I'm going to print what you just said. Okay?
Go ahead. Go ahead. It's a bad picture. Go on. Go ahead, brother. He's a bus driver. He lives in Brooklyn.
Bus driver in Brooklyn. Now, you see? All that?
That paper is not getting into this house, Alex. Hey, off the board! Everything is done word for word.
Well, Victor, what did he say?
Didn't the head of the household show it to you? There it is, right in there. Because I was the only one brave enough to make that idiotic statement, that's why.
Ralph, you think if they'd asked me that question, I would have said that I was the boss?
How could you? How could you, Alice? You're a woman, remember that. Women aren't bosses. Men are bosses. Men, they do it all. Men run this world, Alice. Men, they're responsible for the shape the world's in. Men.
Well, I'm sure glad to hear one of you admit it.
So, it seems like another time, another place, from a different perspective when you hear language like that. And there are a couple ways that we can understand this. A couple options that we can sort of come to terms with this statement. And in fact, with the other ones around it. Because Paul talks about slaves and masters. And that's something also that we can't really totally relate to. And so it's like, well, what's really going on here? There are three options for understanding this. Option number one is that we could say Paul is being cultural. We could say Paul is being cultural. There's a thing that was sort of true back in Paul's day, that there was a household code, whether it was written or unwritten. There was this household code that they all understood. You know, husbands were the head of the household, and wives were supposed to submit and follow them and all that stuff. And so one option is that Paul was just simply echoing the cultural way of thinking here. And as if to say, listen, we're in enough trouble as Christians anyway. The government's trying to hang us or cut our heads off or burn us at the stake. Perhaps we'd do well if we didn't ruffle people's feathers and just didn't rock the cultural boat. Instead, if we just kind of lay low and do things like the rest of the culture, maybe things will be better for us. That's one way of understanding what Paul is saying here. So let's explore that just a little bit and see if it makes sense in the context of what actually shows up. Well, of course, there's the thing about slaves. We don't have slaves today, so perhaps, since this is in the same context as slaves, we should recognize that maybe this is a cultural thing. But I want to draw your attention to the fact that even though Paul talks about slaves, there are two things here that indicate he's not referring to the culture. Okay, check this out with me. There are two things that he says there. First of all, look at every one of the submit people, the wives, the children, and the slaves. It says, wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. And then slaves, obey your earthly masters. And then at the end of that verse, with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. See, what Paul is doing is first of all, he's claiming that there's some type of spiritual connection in the act of this submission and our perspective of God at work in us. It doesn't seem like he's making a cultural claim. He's making some type of spiritual claim. It doesn't tell us what that is, though, in these verses. He's referencing the Lord. Flip it over to the other side, and now look at the husbands, fathers, and masters and see what he says about it. Husbands, he says, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Now, wait a minute. That is a countercultural claim. A countercultural command. You see, back in Paul's day, wives were considered property. They were slightly below or slightly above, depending on the context, the level of the slaves. Men slaves in the house were often ranked higher in the household than the wives were. And so, the wives were just considered basically property. And so for Paul to say to the husbands, you need to treat your wives with love and respect and not be harsh with them, he's going against the grain of the culture. Now look at the next one with the children thing. He says in verse 21, fathers, do not embitter your children. But wait a minute, they're my kids. I can do with them as I please, right? Now he says, don't embitter your children or they will become discouraged. Just a plain and simple how they feel kind of statement. If you're too harsh with the kids, they're going to become discouraged. That's just an emotional kind of thing. I see some kids in here looking at their parents kind of snickering. Are your parents all right? Are they good? Doing a good job? Yeah. So it says, fathers, do not embitter your children, or they'll become discouraged. It's very countercultural. You see, in the day, and sometimes even in today's thinking, children are supposed to be controlled by the parents, not encouraged. They're to be discouraged. We're trying to discourage them from all sorts of things. But Paul says, no, we do not embitter them. Certainly lead them, I'm assuming, but don't embitter them. And then look at the masters thing in chapter 4, verse 1. He says, masters, provide your slaves with what's right and fair, because you know that you have a master in heaven. Again, he's making an appeal to God in heaven. And he says, treat your slaves with right and fairness, because you yourself have a master. Your master, number one, has told you to treat them with fairness. Your master, number two, treats you with fairness. Imitate